Tried every high-tech system in the building. The sleek, digital keypad by the door was dark and useless. And then, her call to security disconnected. Clara's frantic eyes scanned the room, searching for a miracle. They passed right over me at first, as they had all night. But then they came back. Her gaze dropped from my face to my hands, which I held clasped in front of me. The same hands she had recoiled from just an hour ago. The same hands she had hidden away in a corner, lest they offend her guests. Her perfect ruby-red lips parted. The sound that came out was not the confident, commanding voice of the woman who ran a multi-million-dollar marketing firm. It was the voice of a little girl, lost in the dark. "Dad," she whispered, a desperate plea that cut through the rising tension. "Dad, can you—" Every head turned. Richard looked at her, then at me, a sneer of disbelief on his face. All her powerful friends stared at the old man in the ill-fitting suit, the ghost she'd kept in the corner. They stared at my hands, resting one atop the other. Hands with knuckles like worn river stones and a web of scars mapping 40 years of work in a steel mill. Hands that had built the life that paid for this party, this penthouse, this prison in the sky. And in that frozen moment, I saw the question in all their eyes, but most clearly in my daughter's. It was a question born of pure, primal fear. What could these old, rough hands possibly do that all their money and technology could not? As I looked down at my own calloused fingers under the dim, flickering light, my mind pulled away from the suffocating panic of the room. It drifted back just a couple of hours, to the moment I'd arrived, my heart swelling with a painful, foolish pride. I had raised her myself after her mother passed. Worked double shifts, took every bit of overtime I could get, breathing in graphite dust and sweating through my overalls so that she would never have to. I did it so she could have a life like this, a world away from the grit and the noise of the factory floor. I stood at the entrance to her party, a monument to a life she had escaped. I saw a tray of fancy appetizers, little things with shrimp and toast, and I reached for one. But before my fingers could touch the delicate pastry, her hand was on my wrist, soft but with a grip of iron. She leaned in close, her voice a sharp whisper against my ear. "Dad, please," she'd said, her eyes darting towards Richard's boss. "Not with... Your hands are too rough. The guests..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. She gently steered me away from the food, away from her friends, and sat me in a lone chair in a quiet corner. "I'll get you a plate," she promised. But she never came back. The sting of her shame was a physical blow. I sat there, a relic in a museum of her success, feeling the deep, familiar ache of being looked through, of being a necessary but embarrassing part of her past. The cold metal of the railing was a solid, honest thing under my palms. I gripped it until my knuckles, those old, scarred knuckles, turned white. Each word from Richard's mouth was a nail, not just hammered into my pride, but into the very foundation of the story I'd told myself for 20 years. That every aching back, every grease-stained cuticle, every missed school play was a brick laid in the palace of her future. I'd thought I was the architect. Turns out I was just the quarry, the dirt you haul away before you lay the first clean marble slab. The party's muffled laughter was a distant, alien hum. I was invisible, just as Clara had intended when she parked me in that corner. But this was a different kind of invisibility. This was the ghost seeing his own funeral, hearing the true, unfiltered eulogy. The old man. Strip paint off a car. A liability. The words didn't just hurt. They reframed my entire existence. My hands, these tools that had built a life, were now grotesque artifacts. My presence, a threat to their financial future. I looked down at them, splayed on the dark railing. In the moonlight, the calluses were silvered ridges, the network of fine cuts and scars, a map of a lifetime of labor. I remembered the first time I held Clara with these hands. She was so small, so perfect, and I was terrified my rough skin would scratch her. Her mother, Sarah, just smiled her tired smile and said she needs to feel her father's strength. It will make her feel safe. I'd cried then too, but they were tears of a different, purer fear. Now these same hands were deemed too dangerous for canapés and investors. A memory, sharp and unbidden, cut through the numbness. Clara, maybe 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, her small brow furrowed in concentration. She was trying to build a tower out of my old, discarded spark plugs and nuts. It kept toppling, frustrated. Her little hands couldn't get a grip on the slippery, oily metal. "I can't do it, Daddy," she'd wailed. I sat down, my own hands enveloping hers, guiding her fingers. "It's all in the grip, baby girl," I'd said, my voice rough from the day's work. "You don't squeeze it, you just understand its weight. You meet its strength with your own." Together we built a lopsided, greasy tower that reached for the ceiling. She'd looked at me like I'd hung the moon. The sliding glass door behind me whispered open, pulling me back to the chilling present. A young man, maybe one of Richard's colleagues, stepped out, phone pressed to his ear. He gave me a cursory, disinterested glance, the kind you give a piece of furniture. "Yeah, I'm here," he said into the phone, his voice slick with a casual confidence I'd never possess. "Party's a bit of a drag. Richard's on edge. Something about the old man causing a scene earlier. Yeah, Clara's dad. Looks like he just crawled out of a mechanic's pit. Weird. You'd think with all their money they'd at least get him a decent suit." The door slid shut behind him as he left, and the silence he left behind was more profound than before. That was the true bottom. Not Richard's cruel chuckle, but this stranger's confirmation. It wasn't a personal insult, it was a taxonomic classification. I was a different species, a creature from the pit, for the foolish pride I'd felt walking in here, for believing that the world I'd bought for her with my sweat would have a place for the sweat itself. I had sold my days, my strength, my youth, and in return, I got a seat in the corner and a reputation for having paint-stripping hands. I pushed off from the railing. The party inside was a kaleidoscope of silk and laughter, a painting of a world I had financed but was forbidden from entering. Clara was near the fireplace now, holding a delicate flute of champagne, her head thrown back in a laugh at something Richard's boss said. She looked polished, perfect, and utterly removed from the little girl with the greasy spark plugs. My escape from the balcony wasn't a retreat, it was a quiet, final severance. I didn't walk through the party, I skirted its edges, a phantom moving along the walls. I didn't look for my daughter. There was nothing left to say. The words would just get stuck in the graphite dust in my lungs. The night air in the driveway was even colder, cleaner. It felt like the first honest thing I'd breathed in hours. I fumbled for my keys. The familiar heavy keyring with the small, grimy rabbit's foot Clara gave me when she was 6. My rough fingers closed around it. I got into my old truck, the seats sagging in all the right places, the scent of oil and old coffee a familiar comfort. As I turned the key and the engine rumbled to life, a sound far too loud and real for this pristine neighborhood, I took one last look in the rearview mirror. The house stood there, a monument of light and glass. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that I would never cross its threshold again. The bottom wasn't a place to stop. It was a foundation to push off from. The world didn't just go dark, it was swallowed. One moment, I was a phantom skirting the gilded edges of Clara's life, the taste of honest cold air already on my tongue. The next, the universe plunged into a silent velvet black. The music, a string quartet sawing away at something expensive, was guillotined mid-note. The laughter and clinking glasses were replaced by a single sharp collective gasp, the sound of 100 people suddenly remembering they were animals afraid of the dark. Then came the dim orange pulse of the emergency lights. They flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows that transformed the sleek penthouse into a cave of panicked silhouettes. A woman shrieked as someone bumped into her. A man's voice, too loud, declared, "It's just a brownout, people, settle down." But the herd was already spooked. They were lambs, these people. Their world was built on a foundation of light switches and circuit breakers, and without them, they were lost. My own heart wasn't hammering from fear. It was pounding with a strange, grim recognition. As the others fumbled for their phones, creating a constellation of useless tiny screens, my eyes, adjusted to a lifetime of squinting into dark engine bays and poorly lit crawl spaces, were drawn to the wall near the main door. I'd noticed it earlier, just a glint of brass as I'd made my aborted entrance, mostly hidden by the sprawling fronds of a potted monstera. Now, in the stark, utilitarian glow of the emergency light, it seemed to call to me. I took 2 steps, pushing past a man who was wildly gesturing with his champagne flute as if it were a beacon. I nudged the plant aside with my knee. There it was. A small, tarnished brass plate screwed into the wall with an almost religious permanence. The engraving was simple, elegant, and it sent a jolt through my system that was stronger than any power surge. Starkweather Mechanical Systems, 1978. Forget all this electronic nonsense they're pushing now, boy, he'd grumbled, tapping a complex brass mechanism on his workbench. This is pure mechanical genius. Clockwork and physics, no power, no problem. It's the ultimate fail-safe for the day all their fancy silicon brains turn to dust. He was the kind of man who bought the best, even if he didn't understand it. He probably thought it was a vintage aesthetic choice, a charming anachronism, not the building's still-beating mechanical heart. A new kind of chaos was brewing by the front door. A uniformed security guard was there, looking flustered, jabbing at a dead keypad. Richard's voice cut through the murmuring, sharp with impatience. Well, manually override it. There has to be a procedure. Among the mundane keys for my truck and my long-souled workshop was a different kind of metal. It was cold and intricate, a skeleton key not meant for any door in my world, but a relic from my time with Henderson, a Starkweather bypass shim, its teeth worn smooth from use and age, a souvenir I'd never had the heart to throw away, a piece of the craftsman I'd once hoped to become. I could feel the eyes on me as I moved toward the door. I was an anomaly here, a stain on the silken marble. My paint-stripping hands, my scent of graphite and honest sweat marked me as other. Richard saw me approaching, his face a mask of irritation. "Not now, David," he snapped, dismissing me as he would a buzzing fly. I didn't look at him. My focus was on the doorframe, my eyes searching for the telltale seam, the almost invisible hairline fracture in the millwork that would betray the presence of the secondary system. There, just below the dead keypad, a panel so perfectly integrated it was meant to be forgotten. I pressed my thumb against the lower corner, and with a quiet, satisfying click, a small spring-loaded door, no larger than a matchbook, swung open. Inside was not a keyhole, but a complex series of 6 brass sliders, each notched and waiting. A hush fell over the immediate crowd. They were watching the monster work. I pulled the shim from my key ring. It felt right in my hand, an extension of my own bones. This wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about winning back a daughter who saw me as an embarrassing relic. This was about the simple, undeniable truth of a problem and the right tool to solve it. This was a language I understood, a conversation between metal and muscle memory. My fingers found the shim and closed my eyes. I didn't need to see. The memory was a phantom pain in my fingertips, a sequence Henderson had drilled into me until they bled. "Listen to it, boy," his voice echoed in the silence. "The metal will tell you what it needs." With a whisper of displaced air, the massive door swung open, revealing the dark, welcoming emptiness of the emergency stairwell. I didn't look back at Clara, nor acknowledge Richard's stunned silence. The door swung shut behind me, cutting off the gasps and the desperate rush for the exit, and I left their world of failed light for my own of enduring shadow. The silence of the concrete stairwell was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps descending. The burn of Richard's insult morphed into a cold, hard resolve. They saw my hands, my life's work, as a source of shame. But I knew the secret of that old brass plate. I knew that the solution to their very modern problem was buried in the past. a past only I understood. I made a decision. I wouldn't rush in to save them. I would wait. I would let them exhaust every digital, modern, sophisticated option. I would make them see that they were trapped, and then, only then, I would see if they remembered the man in the corner. So I watched. I watched Richard stab at his phone, his face a flickering canvas of frustration in the dim light. I watched him try to call the building manager, security, even the goddamn fire department, his voice rising from a confident baritone to a reedy plea. No service. There's no service, he finally announced, as if it were a personal betrayal. I saw Clara, my brilliant Clara, her fingers flying over the tablet, trying to access some remote server, some cloud-based override. Her brow was furrowed, a perfect replica of her mother's when she was solving a complex equation. She was fighting a ghost in the machine, and the ghost was winning. A younger man, one of Richard's protégés, tried to physically pry the doors apart, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the marble floor. It was pathetic. All that gym-toned muscle, useless against 2 tons of disciplined engineering. The monster, a silent, hulking sculpture of polished wood and steel, simply absorbed their panic. It didn't care, and I stood in my corner, a relic. I felt the weight of the shim on my key ring, a small cold tooth against my thigh. It was my Excalibur, my skeleton key. They designed this building in an era of transition, slapping a flashy electronic deadbolt on top of a heart of pure, mechanical muscle. The kind of muscle Henderson had taught me to understand. Listen to it, boy. The metal will tell you what it needs. The polished, air-conditioned world they'd built had turned into a gilded cage. That's when Richard's eyes, wild and desperate, finally scanned the room and landed on me. Not with hope, but with a dawning, horrifying realization. He remembered. He remembered the stories Clara must have told him, the jokes about her old man and his box of ancient tricks. He saw me not as a savior, but as a last, humiliating resort. "Frank," he said, his voice stripped of its usual condescension, leaving only raw need. "You used to, with locks." The crowd parted for me, not with respect, but with the morbid curiosity reserved for a sideshow act. I pulled the shim from my key ring. It felt right in my hand, an extension of my own bones. I inserted the shim, feeling the delicate pins inside the mechanism kiss the notched metal. I closed my eyes. I didn't need to see. My fingers remembered what my brain had long forgotten. A slight pressure up. A quarter turn counterclockwise, a gentle nudge to the third slider. It was a sequence. A dance Henderson had drilled into me until my fingers bled. A final soft hiss of equalizing pressure sighed from the frame as the seal broke. I withdrew the shim. The electronic deadbolt was still dead, but the primary mechanical lock had been neutralized. I placed my palm flat against the polished wood and pushed. With a whisper of displaced air, the massive door swung open, revealing the dark, welcoming emptiness of the emergency stairwell. I didn't look back at Clara, nor did I acknowledge Richard's stunned silence. Stepping over the threshold, I left their world of failed light for my own, of enduring shadow. The heavy door swung shut behind me, a final note that cut off the gasps and the sudden, desperate rush for the exit. In the concrete stairwell, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps descending into the dark. The air was cooler here, smelling of dust and cold concrete, a familiar, honest scent. Each step was an echo, a hammerfall in the quiet. I didn't know where I was going. The parking garage? The street? It didn't matter. I was moving. I had started a conversation with the silence, and I was content to listen to its reply. I was a ghost again, but this time, I was a ghost who had just reminded the living world that he knew all its secret passages. The shim was back in my pocket, a dormant key to a kingdom no one else remembered existed. And for the first time in a long time, my hands didn't feel old. They felt necessary. While Richard and the building manager on his phone were frantically trying to reboot a dead system, I began my own quiet work. I moved closer to the wall, listening. I could hear the faint rhythmic hum of the building's emergency power, but more importantly, I could hear the silence from the door. No clicks, no servos, nothing. My years in the mill taught me to diagnose an engine by its sound. Now, I was diagnosing a building by its lack thereof. I knew the problem wasn't the lock itself, but the electronic actuator that controlled it. The mechanical override was their only way out. The shim felt warm in my hand, a sliver of spring steel worn smooth by decades of use. It wasn't a key. It was a question, posed to the hidden geometries of the man-made world. I ran my fingers along the door jamb, not looking, just feeling. The polished brass of the keyhole cover was cool to the touch. It was a dummy, a piece of theater for the tenants, a shiny distraction from the real mechanics hidden within the 3-inch steel frame. My fingers found the seam, a hairline crack no one was meant to see. This was the language Henderson had taught me. The grammar of grit and grease, of leverage and consequence. I inserted the tip of the shim. It wasn't a force. It was an introduction, a gentle pressure, a seeking. I closed my eyes, the better to see with my fingertips. There was a faint vibration, the building's own heartbeat transmitted through the metal. Then I felt it. The first internal lever. A nudge. A quarter-turn counterclockwise. It was like tuning an old radio, finding the precise spot where the static cleared, and a signal, pure and strong, came through. My hands remembered the sequence, the dance Henderson had drilled into me until my fingers bled. Pressure up on the shim, a subtle shift in angle, a gentle nudge to a slider my mind's eye could see perfectly. A deep, resonant thunk echoed through the door, a sound of immense physical weight being shifted. It was a sound from 1978, a sound of solid, unassailable engineering. I withdrew the shim. The electronic deadbolt was still dead, but the primary mechanical lock, the one that actually held the 2-ton door sealed, had been neutralized. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped into the void, the door sealing shut behind me with a soft, final sigh. The air was cold and tasted of concrete dust, a profound silence broken only by the frantic rhythm of my own breathing. This was it. The descent into the belly of the beast had truly begun. I didn't look back at Clara. I didn't acknowledge Richard's stunned silence. The heavy door swung shut, cutting off their gasps and the sudden, desperate rush for the exit. The air was cooler here, smelling of dust and cold concrete, a familiar, honest scent. Each step was an echo, a hammerfall in the quiet. I didn't know where I was going, and it didn't matter. I was moving, a ghost in conversation with the silence. The shim was back in my pocket, a dormant key to a kingdom no one else remembered. I had reminded the living world that I knew all its secret passages. I descended past the 20th floor, the 19th, the 18th. The light from the emergency fixtures was a sickly yellow, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted around the central void. The panic from above was a distant memory, a muffled storm on a faraway shore. Down here, there was only the rhythm of my descent and the smell of time itself, the slow exhalation of cured concrete and the faint metallic tang of the handrail. On the 15th floor landing, I stopped. Taped to the wall was a faded, photocopied map of the stairwell, a relic from a different era of safety compliance. A small red arrow pointed downward, labeled exit. I almost smiled. They always point you down. Down is where the crowds go, the predictable flows, the choke points. Henderson's voice, gravelly and perpetually unimpressed, surfaced in my memory. Son, the exit everyone knows about is the one they'll be waiting at. Your job is to find the door. Nobody remembers is a door. But up was where the old mechanical rooms were, the forgotten supply closets, the infrastructure that kept the shiny facade running. Up was where you found the shortcuts. I changed direction. My footsteps, which had been a retreat, now became an advance. The air grew stiller, thicker. On the 22nd floor, a service door, painted the same drab green as the walls, stood slightly ajar. It wasn't on the map. I pushed it open and stepped into a narrow corridor lined with piping, the arteries of the building. The hum was louder here, a deep industrial thrum that vibrated in my teeth. I followed it, my hand skimming the cool metal of the pipes, until I found a small steel-runged ladder bolted to the wall. It led up to a hatch. It wasn't locked. Why would it be? It led to the roof, a place of no consequence. I climbed, pushed the hatch open, and was greeted by the shock of the open sky. The city sprawled before me, a galaxy of artificial light, oblivious to the small drama that had just unfolded within one of its glittering spines. The wind up here was clean and sharp, scouring away the scent of dust and desperation. I walked to the edge and looked down at the street 35 stories below. I could see the tiny, ant-like figures of my former colleagues spilling out onto the sidewalk, looking up at the building, pointing. They were free, but they were still trapped in the narrative of the failure. I was up here, in the silence above it all. The shim was in my pocket. My hands were steady. I had not just escaped a room. I had exited a story they were all still living in. Down there was a world of systems that failed. Up here was a world of truths that endured. I turned my back on the view and looked at the rooftop access door for the adjacent older building. It was connected by a wide, flat parapet. Another door, another question, and my hands were full of answers. The young man from the catering staff, Leo, noticed my intense focus on the wall. He was refilling water glasses, his movements fluid and efficient, a quiet ballet of service amidst the rising panic. He paused beside me, the carafe in his hand momentarily still. "You see something, sir?" he asked quietly, his eyes curious, not dismissive. He didn't see a disgraced CEO, a relic being put out to pasture. He saw a man at work, a man deciphering a puzzle, and in that simple shift of perspective, he gave me back a piece of my dignity. I simply nodded towards the brass plate, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. Understanding dawned on his face, a quick, sharp intelligence cutting through the professional calm. Without a word, he slipped into the kitchen and returned a moment later, his body angled to shield the transaction from the rest of the room. He discreetly pressed a small, powerful flashlight into my palm. His fingers were cool. He was the only person in that whole room who didn't look at me with pity. That small, solid cylinder of metal and glass became my key. While the board members fretted over stock projections and the lawyers mumbled about liability, I was exploring the topography of a forgotten seam in their own fortress. The light revealed what my aging eyes could not: the faint, almost ghostly outline of a door. It wasn't just the brass plate. It was a hairline fracture in the drywall, a vertical line of discontinuity that ran from floor to ceiling. The hum I'd felt, that sub-audible thrum, seemed to emanate from this very line, as if I were listening to the building's slow, mechanical heartbeat. The shim came next. It was an act of pure, desperate intuition. I palmed the sturdy stainless steel from the platter of canapes Leo had been circulating earlier. A simple, blunt tool used to prop open a heavy lid. It felt like a final, unapproved withdrawal from the company I'd built. I waited for a moment when the collective anxiety peaked, a fresh wave of shouts about signal jammers and emergency protocols, and I slid the thin edge of the shim into the crack. There was no dramatic click, no gasp of releasing pressure, just a quiet, solid give. I applied more pressure, my shoulder leaning into the wall, and felt the hidden door shift inward a fraction of an inch. A sliver of profound darkness appeared, and with it, a wave of air so stale and cold it felt ancient. I didn't look back. To hesitate was to be seen, to be pulled back into their narrative of collapse. I squeezed through the opening, my suit jacket scraping against the rough edge of the drywall, and pulled the door shut behind me. The silence was immediate and absolute, a physical blanket smothering the chaos. I was in a narrow, dark space, a forgotten cavity between walls. The only light came from Leo's flashlight, cutting a solitary beam through dust motes that danced like agitated spirits. I was no longer in a boardroom. I was in the building's secret self. The climb was a descent into a different kind of truth, the kind my father had known his whole life. Each flight of the maintenance stairs was a stripping away of the woman I had become, a shedding of a title, a responsibility, a failure. The polished leather of my shoes, so out of place, scuffed against the gritty, unpainted concrete he would have called home. The air grew colder, smelling of ozone and old steel, the familiar perfume of the mill. On the 22nd floor, a service door, painted the same drab green as the walls, stood slightly ajar. It wasn't on my map, but I knew he would have known it was there. I pushed it open and stepped into a narrow corridor lined with piping, the arteries of the building he had helped to build. The hum was louder here, a deep industrial thrum that vibrated in my teeth, a ghost of the rhythm that had once pulsed in his bones. I followed it, my hand skimming the cool metal of the pipes, until I found a small, steel-runged ladder bolted to the wall. It led up to a hatch. The unlocked hatch gave way to the same rooftop I had escaped to moments before. The city's sprawling galaxy of light was unchanged, but the scene below had shifted. Peering over the edge, I saw the tiny, ant-like figures of my former colleagues spilling onto the sidewalk, their faces tilted upward. They were free from the building, yet still trapped in the narrative of its failure, while I remained in the silence above it all. The shim was in my pocket. My hands were steady. I had not just escaped a room. I had exited a story they were all still living in. Down there was a world of systems that failed. Up here was a world of truths that endured. I turned my back on the view and looked at the rooftop access door for the adjacent, older building. It was connected by a wide, flat parapet. Another door, another question, and my hands were full of answers. The parapet was a bridge between eras, a foot-wide ledge of weathered stone, separating the glass and steel ambition of my former prison from the soot-stained brick and granite dignity of the old Northern Trust building. The wind tugged at my clothes, a more insistent force now that I was exposed. I crossed it without looking down, my focus on the door. It was heavy timber, banded with iron that was pitted with rust. There was no modern electronic lock, just a heavy, archaic keyhole, an answer for a different kind of question. I reached into my pocket. The shim was there, cool and familiar. But next to it, my fingers brushed against the other object I'd taken, the small silver pen from the boardroom table, engraved with the company logo. A final, petty theft. I looked from the simple shim to the ornate keyhole. The tools of my old world were useless here. The answers in my hands were for a language this door didn't speak. I was on the threshold, truly untethered. And for the first time since I'd felt the hum in that wall, a flicker of something other than resolve passed through me. The chilling, exhilarating realization that I would have to find a new set of questions. The groan that filled the room was a physical thing, a wave of deflated air that sucked the last of their corporate confidence right out of them. Richard, his face slick with a sheen of panicked sweat, took a stumbling step back from the open maw of the Starkweather panel. His expensive pen, which he'd been using as a futile probe, clattered to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. They were mesmerized by the intricate, malevolent clockwork that lay exposed. A gleaming, coppery gut spill of a bygone era. I let them marinate in it. For 10 perfect minutes, I was a ghost in the machine, watching the pantomime of their helplessness. Sarah from legal suggested they call a locksmith, a notion so profoundly naive it was met with a pitying silence. Mark from finance, ever the pragmatist, tried to map the mechanism with his phone's camera, zooming in on the interlocking levers and graduated brass dials, as if a high-resolution image could decode the physical logic of a dead genius's mind. Their phone lights, stark and clinical, danced over the aged brass, illuminating not answers, but the profound depth of their own ignorance. They were children poking a beehive with sticks, bewildered by the concept of the sting. This was the first piece of my plan, slotting into place with a satisfying, silent click. Not just to escape, but to force them to witness the collapse of their own paradigm. Their world was one of passwords, keycards, and system overrides. Mine now was one of pressure, counterweight, and silence. My gaze drifted from the huddle of suits back to the screen, to the frozen image of my empty chair. They thought the story was about my escape. They were still scrambling for the how. They hadn't yet considered the why or the what next. Their narrative was one of containment and recovery. Mine had just begun its second act. The memory of the rooftop was a cold, clean wind in my mind. The parapet, that foot-wide bridge of weathered stone, had felt like the edge of the world. The wind had been a living force, plucking at my clothes, whispering of the long drop to the sanitized plaza below. I hadn't looked down. My focus had been absolute, channeled into the soles of my shoes, the grit of the stone beneath them, and the heavy iron-banded door that was my destination. It was a door from a different story, one made of soot-stained brick and granite dignity, not glass and steel ambition. Its keyhole was a dark, ornate O, a question mark forged in iron. I'd reached into my pocket then, my fingers finding the two artifacts of my journey. The cool, simple shim of my old trade, and the cold, sleek weight of the silver pen I'd lifted from the boardroom. The shim was an answer, but it was an answer for a different kind of question, the language of cheap latches and false security. This door spoke a dead dialect. The pen was just a trophy, a final petty theft that felt meaningless in the face of that solid timber. Standing there, on the threshold between the world I'd fled and the one I was trying to enter, I felt the plan I'd so carefully constructed in the silence of the ceiling void begin to fray at the edges. The resolve that had been my engine sputtered. A new sensation, cold and sharp, injected itself into my veins. It was fear, yes, but it was also something else. The chilling, exhilarating realization that I was truly untethered. The old rules were gone. The answers in my hands were useless. I would have to find a new set of questions. That moment of terrifying clarity was my true escape. The physical act of leaving the room was just the prologue. Now, watching my former colleagues descend into chaos, I understood the power of that rooftop revelation. They were still trying to solve the puzzle with the tools they understood. They were looking for a digital key, a master code, a command to input. They couldn't comprehend that the system they were facing was analog, its logic rooted in physical cause and effect. It didn't care about their clearance levels. It only understood weight and tension and sequence. I saw Richard, his shoulders slumped, turn to the head of security. "There's no bypass," he said, his voice hollow. It's all mechanical. We get a RAM. My work here was done. The seed of their institutional failure had been planted. They were staring at the locked door, utterly consumed by the problem I had left behind. They didn't know that the real problem was no longer in the room with them. The real problem was already gone, moving through the forgotten arteries of the old building, learning its new language, its new questions, and I was just getting started. Finally, Richard threw his hands up in theatrical frustration. "It's useless. An antique," he declared to the room, trying to reclaim his authority. "We'll have to wait for the fire department to cut through the door. Could take hours." He glanced dismissively at the panel, and then his eyes settled on me, a slow, contemptuous smile dawning on his face. "But then again, I suppose this is beneath an expert like you. Unless those stories about you and your father picking every lock in the old neighborhood were just that. Stories." In dismissing the old lock, he dismissed my entire world, my entire life's worth of knowledge. That was the mistake I was waiting for. The irony was so thick I could taste it, a metallic tang on my tongue like old blood. He was standing there, the golden boy of predictive algorithms, utterly defeated by a collection of levers and springs that predated his own grandfather. His declaration wasn't an admission of failure. It was a coronation of his own ignorance. And the room, my former colleagues, they swallowed it. They saw his frustration as shared burden, his surrender as a sensible next step. They were all waiting for someone with bigger tools, a louder solution. They didn't understand that the solution wasn't about force, but about finesse. It was about listening. I turned from the camera feed, the ghost of my smile lingering. The air in my new sanctuary was different. It was cool and carried the scent of dust and slow decay, a perfume of neglect that was infinitely more honest than the sterile, recycled air of the labs. This was the sub-basement, a place not on the official blueprints, a relic from the building's first incarnation as a printing house. The walls were rough-hewn stone, sweating a slow mineral dampness. Conduits and fiber-optic cables, the lifeblood of the company above, were bolted crudely onto the ancient masonry, a futile attempt to graft the new onto the old. My fingers trailed along the cold stone. This was my canvas now. Their world was one of pure abstraction, of code existing in the ethereal nowhere of the cloud. My world had become this, the gritty reality of matter. I followed a thick, insulated pipe that hummed with a low, constant thrum. The building's main power conduit. A little further, a newer, brighter pipe carried the chilled water for the server farm's cooling system. I mapped them in my mind, not as lines on a schematic, but as arteries and veins. This was the new language I had to learn. Not Python or C++, but the grammar of pressure, flow, and load. A memory surfaced, unbidden. My grandfather, his hands gnarled and stained with engine grease, teaching me about his old Triumph motorcycle. "People see a machine," he'd said, tapping the engine block with a wrench. "They see a problem to be solved. You have to see a story. The piston tells a story to the crankshaft. The carburetor whispers to the spark plug. You just have to learn to listen." I found what I was looking for tucked into an alcove. A junction box, a riot of old and new tech forced into an uneasy marriage. Thick fabric-wrapped wires from the 1920s snaked next to sleek, color-coded modern cables. This was a nexus. From here I could trace the nervous system of the entire operation. I opened my bag, the one I'd prepared over sleepless nights, filled not with digital tools but with physical ones. A roll of copper wire, a set of alligator clips, a small but powerful magnet, a handful of rare earth magnets scavenged from old hard drives, and a simple analog voltmeter. To my former colleagues, this would look like a junk drawer. To me, it was a lexicon. I didn't need to hack their servers. That was a battle fought on their terrain. I needed to influence their environment. A server farm is a delicate beast. It thrives on perfect, stable, cool conditions. Disrupt that, and the digital kingdom trembles. Working by the dim light of a single LED headlamp, I began. I carefully wound a length of copper wire around the chilled water pipe, creating a crude but effective induction coil. I connected it, not to anything that would register on their network diagnostics, but to a series of small, battery-powered heating elements I positioned a few inches away from temperature sensors on the adjacent server racks. The concept was beautifully, stupidly simple. The current flowing through the power conduit induced a minor current in my coil, which warmed the elements. It wouldn't cook the servers, not yet. It would just whisper a lie to the sensors, telling them the room was colder than it was. The system, so proud of its efficiency, would respond by reducing the coolant flow. It was a gentle nudge, a single word in my new language. Back on the camera feed, I saw the fire department had arrived, a splash of yellow coats and heavy equipment in the sea of corporate gray. They were assessing the door, discussing points of entry. The spectacle was reaching its climax. They were all focused on the door, the symbol of their confinement. I was no longer concerned with doors. I was concerned with foundations. Let them have their room. Let them celebrate their eventual brutish victory over a slab of brass and oak. Their triumph would be short-lived. Because while they were breaking down the past, I was quietly recalibrating their future. The seed of their failure wasn't just the locked door. It was the arrogant belief that every system could be understood through the lens of their own digital dogma. They were prisoners of their own paradigm. I closed the junction box, my work invisible. The first question had been asked on that rooftop. What if the problem isn't digital? The next question was taking shape in the damp, dark silence around me. It was a question of consequence. It was, what happens when the walls themselves begin to disagree with you? I gathered my things and moved deeper into the arteries of the building. The story was just beginning, and I was finally learning how to read. The word ours sent a fresh wave of panic through the room. Clara looked like she was about to collapse. Her perfect party, her reputation, all crumbling. Her eyes, wide with desperation, finally found me again. This time, they stayed. She saw my stillness, my silence. She saw that I wasn't panicked. My quiet confidence was the trap. I wasn't offering help. I was a locked door of my own, and she was going to have to find the key. I held her gaze for a moment longer than was polite, a silent confirmation of her unspoken suspicion. Yes, I knew something. Yes, I was different from the herd of panicked executives buzzing around her. Then, I deliberately looked away, turning my attention to the water beading on the chilled neck of a forgotten beer bottle. The dismissal was a calculated risk. I had to make her come to me. The predator has to believe the lure is its own idea. The chaos around me was a symphony of corporate distress. Phones were pressed to ears, voices strained with the effort of explaining the inexplicable to higher-ups who demanded solutions that didn't exist. The system just disagrees. One man stammered into his headset, and I had to suppress a smile. He was closer to the truth than he knew. They were all speaking the wrong language, trying to debug a physical poem with digital syntax. I found a sliver of space near a potted fern, its leaves a dusty artificial green. From here, I could observe without being the immediate focus. The fire crew was now setting up a large, intimidating hydraulic ram, its polished steel a stark contrast to the warm, aged brass of the door. They were preparing to solve the problem with pure, unthinking force. It was the most predictable move in their playbook. Smash the symptom, ignore the disease. A hand touched my elbow. It was Clara. Her composure was a fragile shell, hair slightly disheveled, the champagne flute in her hand replaced by a glass of water that trembled ever so slightly. "You," she said, her voice low, stripped of its earlier performative charm. "You're not surprised by any of this. Do you know how to get that door open?" "A hack. This is a catastrophe." This wasn't the climax. This was the end of the first act. Before she could reply, a new sound cut through the murmur of the crowd, a sharp electronic chirp, followed by another. Then a third. All across the room, phones lit up simultaneously, their screens flashing with identical amber alerts. A collective confused gasp rippled through the executives. Clara fumbled her own phone from her clutch. Her face, already pale, went ashen. She looked from the screen to me, her expression one of pure, uncomprehending horror. "It's the building management system," she breathed, her voice trembling. "An environmental anomaly. It's reporting a cascading failure in the primary cooling loop for the data vault. The servers, they're starting to overheat." "How?" she whispered, the word barely audible. "The door is here. The servers are 3 floors down. They're on a completely isolated network. It's a closed system. It's just started speaking about it in a language you don't understand." And while their backs were turned, the foundation of their entire enterprise was quietly, patiently, learning to disagree. Clara was still staring at me, the key to her problem standing right in front of her, and she was too busy watching her doors splinter to see the walls begin to sweat. The memory of that night crashed over me again, unbidden. I saw her walking towards me, her high heels clicking on the marble, a sound that, in my mind, had become the very echo of surrender. The guests in my memory parted for her. "Dad," she begged, her voice cracking, her gaze locked on my hands. "Please, do you know what this is?" And then, Richard scoffed from across the room, sharp and dismissive. "Clara, be serious. What's he going to do? Hit it with a wrench?" The confrontation was here, playing out once more in my mind, as vivid and painful as the first time. I didn't look at Richard. His was the bluster of a man who only understood force applied directly to a lock. My world was quieter, more fundamental. I kept my eyes on Clara, on the desperate hope warring with the horror in her eyes. She was a brilliant strategist on a chessboard that had just sprouted a new dimension. "I know what it isn't," I said, my voice low, meant only for her. "It isn't a password, it isn't a backdoor, it's a suggestion." The hairline fracture in the oak had spiderwebbed, a dark, jagged vein pulsing with every impact. They were so focused on the tree, they couldn't feel the forest dying. "A suggestion for what?" Clara whispered, her professional composure fraying into raw need. "The system is overheating," I stated, as if commenting on the weather. "Its protocols are binary. Cool or don't cool. The don't cool command is winning. My presence here is a suggestion that there is a third option, to listen. The cooling loop is receiving valid, authenticated commands to shut down. They're coming from inside the system itself. It's rewriting its own maintenance protocols in real time." I ran my fingers over the cool, seemingly solid stone. Clara watched me, her breath held. "You built a fortress," I said, my back to her. "Impenetrable walls, encrypted gates. But you built it in the real world. You gave it a body. And a body has needs. It gets thirsty." I pressed my palm flat against the stone. "It feels the heat." I remembered the blueprints I'd studied not on a screen, but on yellowing paper in the city archives, the original architect's plans for this building long before it became a digital citadel. I remembered the old steam lines, the forgotten conduits for a different kind of power, deemed obsolete and sealed away behind these very walls. "The world isn't digital, Clara." I repeated my earlier statement, this time with more weight. "It's analog. It's a spectrum. Your system is trying to tell you it's thirsty, and you keep offering it a new encryption key." I simply applied a subtle, sustained pressure, a vibration tuned not to break, but to resonate. With a soft, sighing click, a perfectly rectangular section of the wall, about the size of a large painting, recessed an inch and slid silently sideways. Behind it wasn't wiring or conduits, but the building's original skeleton, aged brick, and a massive cast-iron pipe, furred with dust, but still solid, still connected to the city's ancient beating heart. Condensation beaded on its cold surface. It was the main waterline for the building's original long decommissioned cooling tower. A collective, stunned silence fell, broken only by the increasingly frantic pounding on the brass door. They were so close to breaking through, to finding an empty room and a mystery. Clara stared into the dark open cavity in her pristine wall, as if staring into the grave of her own understanding. Her fortress had a secret passage, and it had nothing to do with code. "The system is speaking," I said, my hand resting on the cold, sweating iron. "It's telling you it's connected to things older and more permanent than your firewalls. It's asking for a drink from the well you built your house over. Or you can let me teach it a new word. This wasn't about escape. It was about respect." Richard scoffed, a dry, papery sound. "A conversation? With what, the plaster? You're a relic telling fairy tales while the building's security is minutes from being compromised." The frantic pounding from the brass door was a frantic modern drumbeat against a silence that was profoundly, unsettlingly old. "You said it was asking for a drink," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "What does that mean? You built a temple to the future on top of a spring. You encased it, forgot it, but the spring didn't dry up. It just kept flowing, a constant, low-frequency hum of wetness beneath your floorboards. Your AI, for all its complexity, is built on a substrate that still feels that hum. It's a foundational dissonance. It's trying to reconcile the perfect, dry logic of its programming with the persistent, analog reality of this thirst. And you keep offering it a new encryption key. It was listening to the song of the building's own blood." "The door," Richard barked, as a particularly heavy impact made the brass hinges scream. Clara flinched, her eyes darting between the door and the cavity. I saw the war raging within her, the CEO who needed to protect her assets, and the architect who had just discovered a fault line in her own blueprint. "What word?" she asked me, her decision made in the space of a single shaky breath. "What word do you teach it?" I focused on the vibration, feeling its pitch, its texture. Then I began to hum. It wasn't a melody, it was a mirror. I matched the fundamental frequency of the pipe, my own chest cavity becoming a resonance chamber. I poured my focus into that single, sustained note, feeling it vibrate through my bones, up my arms, and back into the iron. It was a handshake, a recognition. "I hear you," Richard muttered. "This is insane." I pictured the old architect, the one who had signed the original, yellowed plans I'd found in the city archives. A man who believed buildings should breathe. Alistair. It wasn't a password. It was a key. It was the name of the man who had first heard the spring song. I pushed the concept, the resonance of that name into the pipe. This is who you are. This is the memory in your bones. The lights in the penthouse, which had been flickering erratically, stabilized into a soft, warm glow. The high-pitched whine of the overtaxed servers 3 floors below ceased so abruptly the silence felt like a physical presence. From the tablet, a single clear chime sounded. "The core has stabilized," the tech said, his voice hushed. "All emergency protocols have disengaged. The internal lockdown on the data vault is lifting. It's calm." A confused, muffled voice came from the other side. Ma'am, the system just let us in. The breach is contained. We're reading all normal." I slowly withdrew my hands from the cavity. The seam in the wall slid shut with the same soft, sighing click, seamlessly erasing the evidence of the building's secret heart. The wall was pristine travertine once more. "It's not a secret password, Clara," I said, wiping the condensation from my palms. "It's a lineage. You just had to acknowledge the architect." I looked at the now quiet door, then back at my daughter. "The conversation is over." It said everything it needed to say. Each faint, imperceptible click was a step closer, not just to opening a lock, but to proving that my years of rough, unglamorous work had all been leading to a moment that required a touch no softer hand could possess. It was like listening to a story told in Braille. The first dial resisted, stiff with disuse, its internal springs groaning like an old man's joints. I backed off the pressure, then applied it again, coaxing rather than forcing. There was a moment, a subtle softening, and then a deep, satisfying thunk that traveled up my arm bone. 1. The second dial was looser, almost eager, spinning freely for a quarter turn before it, too, found its point of resistance. This one clicked with a higher pitch, a lighter voice. 2. The third was stubborn, a gritty hesitation that spoke of decades of accumulated dust and neglect. I worked it back and forth, a fraction of an inch at a time, until the grit vanished and it settled into its slot with a clean final sound. 3. The silence in the room was a held breath. I could feel Clara's gaze burning into my back, a mixture of skepticism and a dawning, unwilling curiosity. Richard was probably already calculating the lost revenue from not having to hire a demolition crew, but they didn't matter. In that moment, it was just me and the lock, and the memory of a man who believed a building should breathe. My mind drifted back to the penthouse, to the sighing click of the travertine wall sealing itself. The peace that had settled over the building's digital heart was a palpable thing, a quiet hum where there had been a scream. That peace had followed me here, down into the bedrock. It was a thread, and I was pulling on it. With the final click of the third tumbler, a new sensation bloomed under my palms. The brass was no longer cold. A faint, gentle warmth radiated from the center of the panel, the kind of heat a living thing gives off. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Clara. She'd felt the change in the air, too. I didn't turn the handle. Instead, I leaned forward until my forehead was resting against the warmed metal. I didn't speak a password. I pushed a memory into the door, the same way I had into the copper pipe. I thought of Alistair, not as a name, but as a man. I imagined him standing right here in the dust of his own creation, a roll of blueprints under his arm, his hand on this very brass, feeling the heartbeat of the spring he had built his dream around. The lock didn't just unlock. It opened. There was a series of soft, sequential clicks, like stones being gently turned over in a stream. Then, with a sigh of perfectly balanced hydraulics and releasing vacuum seals, the massive door swung inward an inch, silent and weightless on hinges that had been preserved in a state of perfect readiness for half a century. A puff of air escaped, and it didn't smell of damp and decay. It carried the dry, sweet scent of old paper, seasoned oak, and something else, something clean and mineral, like the air deep inside a limestone cave. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. The darkness within was absolute, but it wasn't a threatening void. It was a waiting quiet. I stepped over the threshold. The air shifted, and a soft golden light began to glow from sconces set into rough-hewn stone walls. They weren't electric. They were gas lamps, their mantles igniting one after another with a soft whoosh that echoed gently in the enclosed space, casting a warm, dancing light. The room revealed itself not as a sterile vault, but as a study. It was circular, the walls lined with shelves of dark, rich wood that held not servers or data tapes, but leather-bound journals, rolled parchment, and wooden boxes. In the center stood a large drafting table, its surface clean and empty, as if waiting for its owner to return. A single high-backed chair was tucked beneath it. This was no time capsule. It was a sanctuary. I walked to the nearest shelf and ran my fingers over the spine of a journal. The gold leaf lettering was still bright. Hydrostatic pressures and structural resonance. Volume 7. This was Alistair's mind, given physical form. This was the soul of the building. Clara appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent light of the server room. She hesitated, one hand on the door jamb, her eyes wide as she took in the gas lamps, the books, the profound stillness. "Dad," she whispered, the corporate veneer completely gone from her voice. "What is this place?" And he left a key, not to keep people out, but to make sure only the right person, someone who would listen, could ever find their way back in. Then with a deep, resonant clunk that echoed in the tomb-like silence, the final bolt retracted. The heavy door, which had been standing ajar since my initial entry, now swung fully open on complaining hinges, re-establishing the connection to the lighted hallway beyond. Freedom. Richard stood with his mouth open, his face a perfect picture of humiliated shock. My checkmate was not a word, but a sound, the sound of a problem solved. I didn't look at him as I pushed the door fully open. The victory felt hollow, the corporate skirmish rendered utterly insignificant by what lay behind me. I stepped out, not into a triumph, but back into the threshold of the sanctuary. Clara hadn't moved. She was still framed in the doorway to Alistair's study, a sentinel between two worlds. "Richard," I said, my voice calm, cutting through his sputtering. "The building is secure. Your systems will be back online within the hour. You can tell the board whatever you need to. But this," I gestured behind me into the warm lamplit glow, "is off limits. It was never part of your asset portfolio. Just paper and dust." She finally looked at him, and the corporate mask was back, but it was different now, hardened by a new loyalty. "You have your access. Your crisis is averted. I suggest you go and manage it." With a final frustrated glare, he turned on his heel and stalked down the hallway, the sound of his angry footsteps swallowed by the carpet. The silence he left behind was profound. Clara let out a breath I didn't realize she'd been holding, her shoulders slumping. She turned fully to face me, the awe returning to her eyes. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew this was here all along." Alistair was a man of patterns. He built puzzles into the very bones of this place. The pressure differential, the specific resonance of the structural beams, it was all a clue. The master lock was just the final piece. He believed real knowledge lived in the hand that drew the line, in the weight of the paper, in the smell of ink. For 40 years, this is where he solved the problems that gravity and steel and human ambition threw at him. Every stress calculation for the wind shear on the crown, every schematic for the geothermal piping. It started here. Inside, nestled in beds of faded velvet, were not blueprints, but a collection of smooth, dark river stones, a pair of brass calipers, and a single, weathered leather notebook. "This is volume 0, I said, placing the notebook before her. His first journal. Before the hydrostatic pressures, before the structural resonance, this is where he talked to the land. The pages were filled not with equations, but with sketches of the bedrock, core samples, and the flow of underground springs. There were notes about the song of the stone and margin doodles of trees that had long since been cleared from the site. He didn't conquer this place to build on it, I murmured, looking over her shoulder. He conversed with it. The foundation isn't just anchored in rock, it's in dialogue with it. The entire building is a system of balances and harmonies. We don't force it to stand. We ask it to, and it agrees. He left me the key because he knew I would hear the conversation. And now, I met her gaze, I'm giving it to you. The other was this, a room of whispers, of elegant solutions hidden in parchment and wood, a lifelong study of a single magnificent truth. She closed the cover of the notebook, her hand resting protectively on its worn leather. She didn't look at the door again. "Where do we begin?" she asked. And in the warm, dancing light of Alistair's sanctuary, the real work finally began. A wave of guests departed, leaving a flood of relief and gratitude in their wake. Several of them, including Richard's boss, stopped to shake my hand, their eyes full of a respect I hadn't seen all night. Soon only Clara remained, the silence settling not as a heavy, accusatory weight, but as a vast, empty space between us, filled only by the hum of the now stable systems. She studied the floor, her arms crossed tightly, as if holding herself together against a truth she was only beginning to let in. Minutes stretched, marked only by the quiet, rhythmic beep from a console, a sound that now signaled control instead of chaos. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile thread. "I watched the data stream stabilize. I saw what you did." She swallowed hard, the gesture a painful admission. "I didn't understand what it cost you to get here, what it really meant." She looked up then, not at me, but at the empty chairs, the echoes of the evening. All of this, her words trailed off, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a full apology, but the first genuine crack in her defiance. I didn't offer comfort with words. Instead, I let out a long, weary breath, the accumulated tension of the long night beginning its slow retreat from my shoulders. I looked at her, then at my own tired hands, the instruments of the very solution she had doubted, before finally meeting her gaze again. It was not an absolution, but it was a start. The heavy fire door clicked shut behind me, muting the world into a concrete echo chamber. The air in the stairwell was cool and smelled of dust and static. I leaned my back against the cold wall, the tremor finally starting in my hands. I hadn't conquered the building's tremor. I had borrowed its stability. And now the debt was due. My own foundations felt shattered. The look in her eyes, not the shame, but the dawning, horrifying comprehension of what she had almost thrown away, was a more effective punishment than any anger I could muster. I didn't go far, just down to the service corridor on the 99th floor, to the unmarked door that led into the interstitial space between the outer wall and the inner structure. This was my sanctuary now. Alistair's legacy passed down not through blood, but through understanding. It was a narrow, dimly lit space, humming with the quiet life of the building. The whisper of climate control, the low thrum of electrical conduits, the almost imperceptible groan of the sky-high steel settling against the night wind. I ran my fingers over a junction of pipes, feeling the steady, warm pulse of water moving through the building's veins. This was the conversation. This was the dialogue. And for the first time, I felt like a liar. I had given Clara the key, initiated her into the mystery, but I had just failed the most basic test of its philosophy. Alistair didn't build through force, and he certainly didn't teach through abandonment. He listened, and I had walked away. An hour must have passed. The tremor in my hands had subsided, replaced by a cold clarity. The silence from the penthouse above was a heavier weight than the entire building. I was about to go back, to face the wreckage I'd left, when I heard the soft, hesitant click of the stairwell door. She didn't come to the entrance of my hideaway. She just stood in the corridor, her silhouette framed by the dim emergency light. She was holding something cradled against her chest. "I went to the library," she said, her voice small but clear in the humming silence. I thought I should start from the beginning. I was trying to optimize a heartbeat." She finally looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her expression stark with a new kind of honesty. "When you walked out, I realized I'd broken the dialogue. Not just with the building, with you, and I needed to be left in the silence. It's the only way I could finally hear it." She gestured vaguely around us, at the hum and whisper of the walls. "It's not a song like he wrote. Not for me, not yet. It's more like a language I don't know the words to, but I can suddenly recognize the grammar." It was one of Alistair's simpler sketches, a cross-section of the bedrock showing a fissure that channeled a natural underground spring. Next to it, he had drawn the corresponding section of the foundation, not as a slab meant to seal and conquer, but as an elegant, porous structure that redirected the water partnered with it. He'd scribbled in the margin, "One does not silence a spring. One asks it to sing a different tune." For weeks we'd been trying to fix the elevator shutter with dampeners and recalibrations. We were treating a symptom of a conversation we'd stopped listening to. I looked from the ancient, prescient sketch to my daughter's face, alight with a discovery that had nothing to do with profit or prestige. This was it. This was the moment the legacy truly passed on. Not in the warm lamplight of the study, but here, in a dusty service corridor, surrounded by the honest guts of the place, in the aftermath of a failure that had forced us both to be real. "You found it," I said, my voice thick. "We found it," she corrected. She held out the journal to me, an offering and an invitation. I took it, my hand brushing against hers. The cold stillness between us was gone, replaced by the shared, focused energy of a problem that needed solving. The real work hadn't begun that night in the study. It had begun right now, in the quiet hum of a forgotten space, with a daughter who had stopped reading the words and started listening to the music. "All right," I said, opening the journal to the page she had found. "Show me." The echo of Clara's discovery still vibrated in the corridor, a new, more truthful frequency. Leo, the young caterer, rushed over, his dress shoes scuffing softly on the concrete. He'd been watching from a respectful distance, a silent witness to the tectonic shift between a father and a daughter. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen, sir," he said, his face beaming with an earnestness that stripped away the last of the evening's pretensions. I simply nodded, the gesture carrying more weight than any eloquent speech I might have given at the gala. The boy had seen the truth of the matter. Not a billionaire fixing a machine, but a craftsman listening to his materials. "Never let anyone make you feel ashamed of what your hands can do, son," I told him. The words came from a deep, unguarded place. They weren't just for him. They were a final absolution for my own decades of conflating rough hands with a lack of refinement. I saw the understanding in his eyes, a quick, sharp recognition that this was about more than just a stuck elevator. The elevator doors slid open with a new, almost deferential quietness. I stepped inside, the plush interior a stark contrast to the raw service corridor. As I descended, I looked down at my hands, resting against the fine wool of my trousers, the nicked thumb from a misaligned joist, the permanent stain of walnut oil, the faint silvery line from a slipped chisel. They were no longer flaws, but a testament. I had built my daughter's future from the ground up with these hands, and tonight I had finally opened the door to it for her. A profound peace settled over me, more solid and enduring than any business triumph. She would never see me or my calloused hands the same way again. The descent was smooth, unnervingly so. The shudder was gone, not suppressed, not dampened, but absent. It was as if the elevator itself had sighed in relief. My mind raced, not with corporate strategy, but with the implications of my grandfather's journal. He hadn't just been an architect, he'd been a prophet of stone and flow. He'd listened to the land's intentions and designed a partner for it, not a master. We had spent generations, and especially the last few weeks, trying to be masters, to impose our will. And we had failed. It was only in our failure, in our forced humility, that we had stumbled upon his elegant, patient truth. The doors opened onto the parking level. The cool, dry air smelled of concrete and car exhaust, a grounding scent after the rarefied atmosphere above. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Clara, a single image. It was a photo of the journal page, her finger pointing to another of my grandfather's margin scribbles, one I hadn't noticed in the intensity of the moment. The structure must breathe with the earth, not hold its breath against it. The foundation, the entire building, was a living entity in a slow, patient conversation with the underground springs. We had been trying to shout it down. Now, we had to learn its language. I typed a reply, my thick fingers clumsy on the smooth glass screen. "Meet me in the study in 30 minutes. Bring the journal. We have a new blueprint to draw." It echoed in the vast, empty garage. She was already there. Of course she was. The legacy hadn't been passed in the study the first time because I had been doing all the talking. Now, we would both listen. The drive home was a blur of city lights and shifting perspectives. I saw the skyline not as a collection of my conquests, but as a dialogue with physics, with materials, with the very ground upon which it all stood. I thought of Leo, the caterer, and the unvarnished admiration in his eyes. It was a purer form of respect than any I'd received in a boardroom. It was the respect one craftsman has for another. When I walked into the study, the scene was entirely different from that first, fraught night. The fire was crackling, and the large oak table was spread with the journal, modern geotechnical surveys, and Clara's tablet, its screen glowing with complex hydrological models. 2 steaming mugs of black coffee sat waiting. She looked up, her face smudged with a bit of dust from the archive, her eyes clear and focused. "The variance he predicted," she said without preamble, tapping the journal. "It's not a linear shift, it's a pulse, a seasonal ebb and flow, the shudder in the elevator. It wasn't a breakdown, it was the building's heartbeat. We were trying to medicate a heartbeat. We looked at the documents together, the century-old ink and the modern digital renderings. The problem was no longer a ghost in the machine. It was a map, a song, a conversation we were finally ready to join. My hands, resting on the table next to hers, no longer felt like relics of a past I'd tried to outrun. They were the very tools I would need for the future. They were my